Welcome to episode 5, The Answer. I'm your host, Mick Larson, the producer and director of the documentary series, What Would Jesus Do on Election Day? As your host, I'll be introducing you to the authors, professors, journalists, and theologians that contributed to this series. All right, let's get started with episode 5, The Answer. First, you'll hear from Father Paul Turner. He's a pastor at Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Kansas City, Missouri.
It's a great question. It presumes he's an American citizen. Well, my gut wants to answer that question this way. Of course he would vote, because that's what good Americans do.
Next up, we hear from Bill Timaeus. Bill is a journalist and author covering religion. His latest book is entitled The Value of Doubt.
I think Jesus would take sides in terms of values. The issue of racism, for instance. White privilege has kept black people down for decades and decades and decades, and Jesus would say that you can't treat people like that. You've got to recognize what's going on in your lives.
Next up is Genesis B. She is an artist and activist.
I think that today, Jesus's original message has gotten lost, and it's gotten lost in skewed intentions where people try to use Christianity and the Bible as a way to oppress others or to other people. And I just believe that if Jesus was alive today, I think he would be appalled to see how Christians, so-called Christians, behave and treat other people, how we treat children, how we treat people of color in this country, how we treat people who do not identify as heterosexual, white, rich male. So I think Jesus would probably be a little appalled, and Jesus would probably be one of the oppressed in America for sure.
Okay, we hear from journalist Bill Timaeus again.
God, through Christ, was interested in the poor. He focused on folks who did not have enough and suggested that we ought to live in a simple way. That I don't disagree that wealth can be a good, useful thing, in fact, and we should not feel guilty if somehow we've inherited money or we've made our own money. But you're right, the question is, how are we using that? What are we doing with that? I think Jesus would, as I say, look at the systems we have in place. He would look, for instance, at the incredible difference between the so-called top 1% and the bottom, and say, people, there's something wrong here. This is a broken system. So let's find public policies that address that. He would look at the ways in which our schools are failing our children and say, these are children that we ought to be loving and giving an opportunity to, and let's find ways, given the public school system that we have here, of doing better.
Next, we'll hear from Troy Jackson. Troy is the state strategies director at Faith in Action.
Jesus would constantly be asking, what are the implications of these systems and structures for those who are on the margins? I think Jesus would talk about race and the legacy of white supremacy and racism a whole lot. I think Jesus would talk about what it means to welcome the immigrant and the stranger and the refugee a whole lot. I think Jesus would, if Jesus was turning over tables of folks trying to profit off religion and profit off the poor during the Passover outside the temple, there'd be a lot of money changers' tables being knocked over in Wall Street and around this nation.
Next up, we hear from Jimmy Itzak. He's the former director of church life at Second Presbyterian in Kansas City, Missouri.
I see in the two political parties that exist either an emphasis on me or an emphasis on we. The world that I've come to embrace and that I live in now focuses way more on the village mentality of, if you're not okay, we're not okay. If you're in pain, we're in pain. If you're at loss, we're at loss. And for me, I see that in a biblical sense. If you look at Acts in the early church, it says they sold everything they had and gave to anybody in their community that was in need. They came together and devoted themselves to these things. Nobody wanted for anything. And yet I can't figure out how that principle hasn't continued on.
Next up, we hear from Father Paul again.
I think Jesus very definitely would challenge people. He did in his own day. Those parables are tremendously challenging. Able to listen to him speaking to our community today, he would give us a lot to think about. You think about his message and you put it in contrast with how you're living your life, and you might not feel so enthusiastic about it all. I think Jesus would have that kind of effect.
And we're back with journalist Bill Timaeus.
He would say, are you kidding me? You've got all this wealth in the world, and you've got people in this country who can't get decent health care coverage? There's something wrong with that. We Americans focus on the individual, what's right for me, and we lose this idea of the common good. The question finally is, are you sacrificing the good you can do to needy individuals and to ministry to people in need for your own self-aggrandizement?
We have a new contributor to introduce, Dr. Allen Frances, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, School of Medicine, Duke University. Dr. Frances is also the author of The Twilight of American Sanity.
It's absolutely obvious that Jesus would be espousing those policies that would most help our most vulnerable. He would be most against the billionaires who now control our government. He would kick them out of his temple. He did kick the billionaires of ancient Jerusalem out of the temple. And he would be trying his best to provide charity for the people who most need it.
Next, we hear from Jimmy Itzhak again.
I think Jesus would side with the people that are merciful. And I see a lot of stances, platforms, campaigns on the left politically that really do value people and that really do not just care about whether or not they're born, but care about them when they're here, that care about their well-being, that give people second and third and fourth chances. Jesus, to his credit, would find a way to try and talk to both sides, but I think Jesus would celebrate a lot of the things that happen on the political left, because I think a lot of those issues and a lot of those campaigns, a lot of those efforts are going to reach the people that Jesus spent a lot of time with. And I think Jesus wanted that to happen and would fight and advocate for that to happen.
Next up is Professor Edward J. Bloom. He is a professor of history at San Diego State University and the co-author of The Color of Christ, the Son of God, and the Saga of Race in America.
Political style and attitude, and when I bring together Barack Obama and Donald Trump, I see a significant amount of humility on one hand, and I see a great deal of hubris on the other. And that sense of being willing to learn. Jesus had this line over and over again, he who has ears, let him hear. And I get that sense, that political persuasion sense from Barack Obama, not from Donald Trump. So when we think about where would Jesus align, to whose camp would he kind of be more comfortable in, I can definitely see it more comfortable in a humility-based political approach rather than a kind of more arrogant, boastful. Even the phrase, make America great again, is fascinating. The emphasis on greatness and the emphasis on strength and power when, Jesus told stories about how it was the poor widow's prayer and it was the least of these who would be first. Jesus went to pains to say that his kingdom wasn't of this world. And so I think what would happen is he would try to avoid any political alignment, and that everyone else, Fox News and CNN would try to like push him into one of those. But I don't think there's any way in the world I could foresee, Jesus pulling a lever for the Republican Party, and the reasons for that. One would be an unwillingness to admit wrong. And what I find interesting about that is, the Lord's Prayer, the most famous prayer Jesus ever says, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And the Republican Party and Donald Trump seem awfully insistent on never apologizing. And when it comes to issues of race, whether it's slavery, segregation, lynching, not only do they not want to apologize, they want to be in cahoots. They want to kind of bring in people who celebrate those traditions. So I can't see how Jesus' morals, his teachings would fit. I could see Jesus saying to Donald Trump, leave everything and follow me. I could see him basically saying, hey, if you want, kind of like the young prince, the biblical story where Jesus says to the prince, hey, there's one thing you haven't done. Leave all of your wealth, leave all of your status, and come and follow me. And the prince leaves unhappy because he doesn't want to do that. But yeah, I can't see any way in the world that Jesus would buddy up with the Republican Party.
Well, for better or worse, we hear from me next. There are two different tracks we can go down to show how Jesus would never align himself with the Republican Party. I'm talking about the Republican Party after the passage of the civil rights bills of the 1960s, because moderate Republicans were very instrumental in the passage of those civil rights bills. But as white resentment and backlash mounted after the passage of the civil rights bills, the Republican Party was more than happy to switch from the party of Lincoln to the party of the Southern Lost Cause. The first track is racism. I don't think Jesus is going to make the same mistake many good Americans make by joining a voting bloc that contains the KKK, white nationalists, and white supremacists. If you are a Republican today, how do you look in the mirror and say, I vote with some of the worst elements of human nature and the worst parts of American history? I don't think there's much debate on this issue. Jesus is not going to vote with the tiki torch wing of the Republican Party. The other track is policy. The main policy positions of the Republican Party go against the teachings of Jesus. Jesus was mainly concerned about the welfare of the sick and the poor. He was also concerned about the wealthy taking advantage of those less fortunate. The tenets of small government, low taxes, free market capitalism, restrictions on immigration, increased military spending, deregulation and restrictions on labor unions, all these tenets go against helping the sick and the poor. Do low taxes help the poor? Does free market capitalism help the sick? Does restricted immigration help God's children? Does increased military spending help the homeless? Does deregulation and restrictions on labor unions help the poor trying to get a living wage so they can pull themselves up by the bootstraps? I'm not sure how you can follow Jesus and vote Republican. You're going to have to pick a side. Are you going to follow the teachings of Jesus? Or are you going to vote Republican and keep your taxes low and not help the people that Jesus wants us to help? Here's the thing. If you're well off, you don't need a big government. You don't need universal health care. You don't need a great public educational system. You don't need a social safety net. Your money and wealth is your personal social safety net. It's the poor and the sick that need a bigger government that provides critical public assistance. It's the poor and the sick that need increased taxes for universal health care. It's the poor and working class that need strong unions. The titans of industry and corporate America don't need strong unions. They need a Republican Party that is trying its best to undo the strength of unions that historically provided Americans with well-paying jobs. Jesus teaches us to advocate for the downtrodden, the powerless, and the marginalized. Jesus was, in essence, a community organizer, trying to help people, teaching us to love our neighbors both near and far. When Barack Obama ran for the presidency in 2008, he was lambasted by the right for being a community organizer. Why would Jesus vote with a party that thinks being a community organizer is less than? There is a through line starting with Barry Goldwater to Donald Trump. That line is fear. Fear of the other. Fear of sharing the abundance that America has provided specifically to white Americans. Jesus' message was one of hope. It was one of raising people up. The Republican Party is a party of fear, not hope. It's a party keeping what's yours and not raising people up. It's obvious Jesus is not going to align himself with the Republican Party. Thankfully, the Democratic Party is about hope. It's about raising people up. It's a party that looks like the diversity of America. It's a party embracing inclusion, equity, and the teachings of Jesus, providing for the sick and the poor. Jesus could find a home in the Democratic Party, but he would certainly be asking the same question to both parties. Why aren't you doing even more to help all of God's children? Next up is Paula Ioannidis. She's an associate professor of comparative race and ethnicity studies at Ithaca College in New York.
The Republican Party has always sort of used this kind of race baiting strategy, right? Beginning with the Southern strategy to, once again, at the public feeling level, those emotional economies that I was talking about, create and cultivate what has always been an undercurrent, which is the potential, the political value of white resentment. So that anytime there is this kind of push towards expanding the social wage, so that it's fair to women, it's fair to poor people, it's fair to people of color, whether through affirmative action or through fair housing policy or through better educationally funded schools or through desegregation, right? That anytime there's a push for that, the Republican Party has sort of used this race-baiting, dog whistle politics to revamp the sense that, hey, white Americans, you're about to lose something here. You're about to be encroached upon in terms of your advantages and social positioning by all these factions, right? And that has almost always worked to essentially bring a much more conservative agenda in place.
Next up is Dr. Alan Francis again.
The Republicans catered to the perceived needs of people in the rural South in terms of religious fundamentalism, anti-gay, anti-abortion, gun rights, in terms of racial discrimination, American injustice, long prison sentences for blacks. These were tools used by the Republican Party to capture the South. And then the next extension was to realize that these same policies would be very popular in states in the North that had large rural populations that were suffering greatly during the mechanization of labor, no more farm laborers, a decrease in factory work because of the robotics and the taking of jobs from rural America, industrial factories, and planting them in Mexico and then in Asia, that these places were suffering, and that the same policies that had been effective in capturing the South of the United States would be effective in capturing rural areas in the rest of America. So the Republican Party became the party of the past, the party of older people, the party of the most bitter, the most worried about change, the most worried about new social configurations, the increasing power of women, the increasing power of black civil rights, the increasing power of gay civil rights. The Republicans represented themselves as the protectors of the past for people who were very frightened of the present and very uncertain about the future.
All right, our last comment for this episode is from Reverend Gayla Rapp. She is a retired pastor in the United Methodist Church.
You know, I love Jesus more than I love the church. And people are sometimes surprised to hear me say that as a pastor. But there are times I think Jesus calls me to hold the church accountable when it's been less than loving. And I'm clear that when we worship in here on Saturday night and Sunday morning, we don't worship the church. We come to worship God. And we come to worship the God revealed to us in Jesus. And that God revealed in Christ sometimes calls us to be in conflict with the church and with the law of the church. And I'm comfortable in that place, finally, after many years of ministry. And I'm thankful for Jesus, who calls me to be bold and brave, even when it's contrary to what the world is teaching.
Okay, that wraps up episode 5, The Answer. I hope that was a thought-provoking episode. Even if you don't agree with the answer, I hope it sparks a great conversation. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I hope you'll join us for episode 6, entitled Ourselves and Others. The episode examines why our politics and culture is so tribal. Thanks, and take care.